The Enlightenment motto is dare to reason, but we can reason essentially in two different ways. There's reasoning before experience, that's a priori as Kant argued from, or there's reasoning from experience, a posteriori, as the Utilitarians, Bentham, Mill, argued from. There are two ways of applying reason, but they're radically different, and they have different ways of approaching the question, what is good? The Utilitarians argued as a psychological fact that human beings pursue pleasure and avoid pain. And therefore, the one intrinsic good is pleasure. The one thing that is good in itself is pleasure. And the one thing that is evil is pain. And for Jeremy Bentham, pleasure is a quantitative thing. You can measure it. It's a scientific idea. It's a bit like measuring the length of a football pitch or anything else. And you can measure it, said Bentham, according to a hedonic calculus, where hedonic means to do with pleasure, and calculus just means a way of calculating how much pleasure. He divided this hedonic calculus into 7 elements, which is summed up by the acronym PRICED with 2 R's. That stands for purity, reliability, remoteness, how near and far, intensity, certainty, extent, and duration. We can illustrate this with a little drama sketch about ice cream.
Hello.
Hello!
And what's your name?
Jerry.
Jerry who?
Jerry can where Kant can't.
I can do what?
Jerry can show the secret of pleasure, the secret of goodness.
Ooh, how do you do that, Mr. Jerry?
Well, imagine we're making a delicious new flavoursome ice cream.
How about some raspberry ripple? Or some chocolate? And how about some lemon sorbet?
So what delicious things would you want in it?
Ooh, how about some pure chocolate?
Of course, the richest we can find.
And a reliable texture of nuts and raisins that's just yummy every time. And an intense bouquet of raspberries with a very sure and certain minty flavour.
So creamy you want to share it with your extended family and made for everlasting duration.
And what's that priced at, Mr. Bentham?
You've just misspelt priced.
I know. That's how my teacher told me I was to remember your 7-fold hedonic calculus of quantitative pleasure, derived a posteriori from the world of experience on a teleological principle of consequentialism, with just one intrinsic good, namely pleasure, measured empirically as a balance over pain.
You've forgotten something.
What?
Everyone to count as one, and no one to count as more than one.
So it's Benny's 7-fruit slurper all round, is it? Nice dream, Mr. Jerry.
Thank you, Miss Ben. That'll be £43 and 6 pence, please.
Maybe you should stick to abstract linguistics, Mr. Bentham.
There are 1 or 2 problems with this emphasis on pleasure as the one intrinsic good, and that sketch illustrates this rather well. Are we simply talking about quantity of pleasure? Is eating an excessive amount of ice cream, say until you feel a bit ill, actually as good as listening to Mozart? That's a question that Mill put on the question of pleasure. Secondly, it's open to a much deeper objection. We can still ask the question, it may be pleasurable, but is it good? Is it, for example, good for me from a health point of view to eat so much ice cream? And if we can ask that question, it may be pleasurable, but is it good? We're actually suggesting that there is another layer to morality, a layer of morality, a further step we can take to establish the goodness of an action. Pleasure by itself may not be enough. Bentham then is really arguing that there is one intrinsic good, pleasure. We need to maximize it. That's the maximum amount of pleasure minus pain for the maximum number of people. He called that the greatest happiness principle. And that it is measurable in a quantitative way, almost like science. I think we often fail to grasp the radicalism of Jeremy Bentham. He was a great social reformer. And one of the things that he said was everyone to count as one and no one as more than one. The Queen and you and me, we've all got the same number of hedons to make choices about. The Queen's pleasure, your pleasure, my pleasure, they should all count equally in the general social calculus, the calculation of the general good or the greatest happiness. Why is this so radical? Because we can use utilitarian ethics to frame legislation about important social issues. And I would argue it works particularly well looking backwards. So in 1967, for example, when they passed the first Abortion Act, they looked backwards at the experience of young girls, 16, 15-year-old, who would be going into hospital after botched abortions, and some of them even dying from the effect of abortion being illegal. And so looking backwards, you could weigh the fact that the pain or the disutility of having so many illegal abortions vastly outweighed the utility of making abortion illegal. And so they decided to reform abortion, to make it legal under certain controlled circumstances. But does it work so well looking forwards? Look back at the Iraq War, 2003, when we invaded Iraq. And the argument there was we should do so because the benefit, the happiness that would result, outweighs the pain. So we envisaged a quick victory. That certainly happened. But then the further consequences of 1.3 perhaps million Iraqis who have died since. And of course the present social chaos in Iraq, which is dividing into 3 states, a Kurdistan, a Sunni militant state, and a Shiite state, that was never envisaged back in 2003. And so even using a calculation going forward has got one huge problem. We can never perfectly determine consequences. It may be both difficult to calculate from a hedonic point of view, but even more problematic, we never precisely know what those consequences would be. And remember, you've got to calculate consequences if you're going to make a decision looking forwards about which is the best course of action, the action that is morally good.